Hi, my name's Tracy Chauvin. I'm going to be walking you through the case study, A Good Teacher Turns Bad. A decorated teacher changes when trouble at home comes to school, for EDL 851. What do I know? I know that we're at Crestview Elementary School, which is in a rural area and is one of 3 area elementary schools. Parents have historically been happy with Crestview. Staff has been together 8 years and are proud of the school and student accomplishment. Staff also includes a school counselor. They've been chosen to pilot a new reading program this year. We know that Mrs. Wilson is the current principal and that she has 13 years teaching experience, and this is her 4th year as the principal at Crestview. Her first year as an administrator, she didn't want to rock the boat, per the recommendation of one of her professors. We also know at the end of the 3rd year in the 3rd quarter, Mrs. Wilson noted changes in Mrs. Horton's interactions with staff. They become increasingly negative. We know that Mrs. Horton is a 1st grade teacher at Crestview. She's a former teacher of the year in the school district. And per staff, Mrs. Horton's husband has recently left, leaving her alone to raise 2 teen boys. What's going on? Within the first 6 weeks of school, the principal has begun to receive phone calls and letters alleging Mrs. Horton is being verbally abusive, screaming at students who make mistakes. And Mrs. Wilson's assurances that she has been in Mrs. Horton class regularly and see no evidence of this treatment is not reassuring parents. We also know Mrs. Horton is frequently late to work. We know that Mrs. Horton is refusing to hold parent-teacher conferences, and the superintendent and Board of Education have received 4 contacts from parents. They want their children moved to another classroom from Mrs. Horton's classroom. We know that Mrs. Wilson has stated she's going to investigate this. Mrs. Wilson set up a meeting with Mr. Stafford, who showed up one morning with Mrs. Horton for the next day. At this parent meeting, Mrs. Horton appeared unprepared, which was evident by her needing to gather work samples and her gradebook. When Mr. Stafford started speaking, Mrs. Horton became verbally aggressive, screaming at Mr. Stafford and storming out of the room. What do I need to know? I need to know, has this ever occurred before? What are the policies and procedures in the district? Is there an employee assistance program? What does the negotiated agreement say? Are there mentorship opportunities? What does the district have available to support in this situation? And is there documentation of the previous year's negative interactions with staff and the conferences had with Mrs. Horton, of the observations in Mrs. Horton's room this year? What are the experiences of the other students in the classroom? More information regarding the 4 families that called the Board of Education and superintendent. What, if anything, did the superintendent recommend? And what are the current number of sections in 1st grade? Is it even feasible to move students? And what does rock the boat constitute in terms of a leadership style? Let's walk through the problem. What steps need to be taken for parents and students to repair their relationship and restore faith in Crestview? So how can we make parents and students feel safe at school? What steps need to be taken for Mrs. Horton to feel she's receiving support, but ensuring that students' needs are being met and we're following protocols? So how can we best support Mrs. Horton through this situation? Our plan of action. We need to conference with Mrs. Horton as quickly as possible to gather details, figure out how all conference requests have been handled, specifically Mrs. Stafford, Julie's mother, who's reached out. We need to also offer support via the Employee Assistance Program, mentorship, and any other district initiatives and programs that would support Mrs. Horton through this hard time. We also need to do a formal write-up and documentation of the unprofessional behavior during that parent-teacher conference, and the excessive tardies to work, and based on what was found out about how the conference requests were handled, also document lack of responses to the conferences. I need to set up a second meeting with Mrs. Horton to discuss the write-ups and create an improvement plan based on this. And that plan would include random walkthroughs, formal observation, and the use of support staff, such as a teacher's aide in class to support and assist Mrs. Horton throughout instruction. This will allow Mrs. Horton the ability to tap out when needed versus bottling frustration, and it models positive coping skills for the students. I need to provide a substitute teacher for that day after Mr. Stafford's parent-teacher conference, or coverage for the classroom until a substitute is found. And then I also need to provide one potentially for the next day as well while doing these inquiries. I need to conference with Julie, other students, and other families who have reached out. Offer support of the counselor who's in the building to provide ongoing emotional support and processing for those affected by Mrs. Horton in this situation. And due to the egregiousness of Mrs. Horton's actions during the conference, I need to move Julie to a new classroom for her and her family to have a fresh start. In order to maintain relationships with all the families in that classroom, set up an increased communication plan for Mrs. Horton and Mrs. Wilson in order to rebuild trust. And then, following all of this, with respect to Mrs. Horton's privacy, update all parents, the superintendent, and any other vested parties in order to ensure that there is transparency during this process. What's best for students? What's best for students? Students need to feel safe, and they will feel safe with an extra adult in the classroom and the increased visibility of the principal in the classroom. That also provides accountability and support for Mrs. Horton. Meeting with the students validates their feelings, helps them feel heard, and helps build that culture of trust and lets them know that they, as students, are important and valuable members of the community and that our culture is responsive to their needs. It also builds their ability to proactively advocate for themselves in a positive manner. When we meet with them regularly, we talk with them regularly. In providing counseling to these students and that long-term emotional support, we're providing what's best for the students. And in gathering the support and rallying around Mrs. Horton to promote a safe and supportive learning environment by offering her the employee assistance counseling, she will have the opportunity to learn and practice coping skills in order to process her emotions and be better able to regulate and model regulation at school. That's in the best interest of all students. What am I feeling during this? Frustrated that it wasn't really addressed more fully during that third year of Mrs. Wilson's principalship. A little shocked that it got that far and that Mrs. Horton allowed herself to become so frustrated, so enraged that she is taking it out on students and families. Hopeful that this plan will support all involved, the families, the students, Mrs. Horton. I'm valuing the trust the parents have in the school based on their history and based on the positive image of Crestview, and valuing the rights of all involved, the students, the parents, the staff, and Mrs. Horton. I'm thinking that Mrs. Wilson should have stepped in sooner, that if during that third year, that third quarter after spring break, she had been a little more assertive, that this might not have gone that far. Hopefully, the team can rally around Mrs. Horton, the students and families, that the building, that culture is there to support all of them. I'm also thinking, how will this affect Mrs. Horton long term? Her feelings, her thoughts, her emotions, that new dynamic in the building. There are some questions unresolved. Mrs. Horton's personal situation. We can't do a lot for that, so that will remain unresolved for her professional life here at Crestview. The ramifications of this situation. Parents all talk, and this could potentially have long-term impact on the school. The student reaction to Mrs. Horton. How will that change the dynamic? How will this create a culture, maybe of fear, and how can we combat that? What do the students think? That's going to remain unresolved for the rest of this year as we continue to support them. And then the new dynamic that has been created in the building between Mrs. Horton and her coworkers, because she did treat them disrespectfully. She was aggressive with them. So how do we resolve that as well moving forward and long term? Looking at Standard 2 for instructional capacity. An educational leader promotes the academic success and personal well-being of every student by enhancing instructional capacity. Let's look at the academic success component. The willingness and possibility of moving students. The willingness and possibility of dismissing Mrs. Horton. In interviews with students and parents, really focused on that academic success component. What is in the best interest of students? How can we create the best possible learning environment? Looking at personal well-being of all students, involving the school counselor, emphasizing safety and security of all students, not just Julie and not those with the loudest, most vocal parents, but every single student going into that classroom, talking with those students, providing that counselor, all emphasizes personal well-being. Also, increased communication emphasizes the well-being of the whole child and the family, seeing them as a combined unit, making sure that there is transparency, really emphasizes the well-being. Enhance instructional capacity by increasing walkthroughs and formal observations, providing a mentor and additional support, and putting together a formal improvement plan. We really have supported Mrs. Horton in her professionalism and to develop her skills through this. Thank you so much for going through this case study with me for EDL 851.